Hi, my name's Jack Tasker. I'm a creative writing graduate from Liverpool John Moores. I graduated in 2012. The book that I'm going to be reading from is called Currents. And to answer your first question, the inspiration and why I started writing it. In 2012, I watched The Darjeeling Limited by Wes Anderson, and I was really inspired by that, the kind of melancholic, comedic nature of it, and I really wanted to replicate that in a novel and have something that was about loss and about family, but also had a kind of humour and a sadness to it. And so I started writing this piece, Currents, which is set in a small fishing village in northern Scotland, completely sort of cut off from society. And the novel follows a young man who's running away from London, and you don't really know why he's running away until the very end. And so it's sort of following this past of his that's ready to explode and ruin him. And then also it follows the story of sort of the head of that village in Scotland, an old guy who's dealing with loss in his own way, and as opposed to running away physically from a place, he's drinking and falling out with family and friends, and his world slowly unraveling around him. So it follows those two and how they meet and what follows on from there. In terms of your second question, which is how far through the novel am I? It's completed and it's on its first redraft, and when that's done it'll be passed on to fellow writers and people whose opinion I hold very highly, and get them to read through it, and then it'll be the second redraft and so on until I'm happy with it. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I'll be reading the first chapter, which is called Dogger and Cromarty, and it's from the perspective of the old man who lives in the fishing village and is now beginning to face life after loss. Thank you. Currents, Chapter 1, Dogger and Cromarty. The old man's weathered hand worked the dial as if it were a lock on a safe, slightly to the left, slightly to the right. He listened to the crackle fade in and out. The voice became clearer, then flew away again, teasing him, dancing on the airwaves. Ash fell from the cigarette clamped between his lips and landed on his idle hand. He didn't flinch or show any pain. His attention was focused entirely on the radio in front of him. The crackle dipped and a soft, well-spoken voice cut through. Southeasterly gale force 8 imminent, increasing storm force 10 soon. Then disappeared into fuzz again. Useless piece of junk, he grumbled, leaving the dial alone, fiddling with the aerial instead. After another half minute of careful tweaking, the voice cut through, clear, free of crackle and distortion. Moderate or rough, becoming very rough for a time. He couldn't help but grimace. It had been an awful winter, one which showed no signs of improving. He'd taken his crew out in conditions he'd normally consider suicidal, but they needed to make a living. He was dead set against calling the fisherman's mission. Issagar had managed to survive without them, and he didn't want to submit now. His father had never asked for their help. He'd always figured out a means of muddling through the hard times. Good, becoming poor or very poor for a time. There was always a first for everything though, he thought. The fuzz kicked up again, but he corrected it with a flick of his index finger. He listened to the forecast, taking long drags on his cigarette. His eyes were locked on the middle distance. He rarely blinked. To anyone walking past, he would have looked like a corpse, but there was no one walking past. This was his study. It was 10 to 1 in the morning and pitch black outside. No one would be walking past. He was utterly alone. His cigarette burned down to a pathetic butt, which he dropped into the glass ashtray on the table. Outside, the rain was howling, thrashing against the window, but it didn't faze him at all. He was miles away, thinking, planning, scheming. He wondered if his son was up at this dark, lonely time. Perhaps he was. Perhaps he was staring into the nothingness whilst thinking about him. It was possible, though it would be a first. But there was always a first for everything, he smiled. Moderate or poor, occasionally very poor. Thank you for listening. We're now going over to the World Service. Take care. Good night. He switched the radio off. It wasn't good news at all. He couldn't take care, sleep well, wrap up warm and cosy. Tomorrow he'd be taking his crew out into a sea that was seething, desperate and hungry. He believed that the ocean had a mind of its own, a malicious, bitter mind, racked by the unending march of the ages. Worry didn't even cover it. He had the lives of nearly all the fit and able men in Issagar clutched in his hands, and he was juggling with them. There was only one good way to deal with the stress, fear and worry: a bottle kept in the kitchen cupboard.